The county assessor pulled up to the farm, stepped out of his car, and just stood there. He counted the acres twice because the first number couldn't be right. 1,200 acres, all owned by one man, all paid for, all worked with equipment that should have been in a junkyard 20 years ago. The assessor looked at his paperwork, looked at the farm, and said out loud to nobody, "How did he do this?" The answer to that question starts in 1961 on a dirt road in Lafleur County, Mississippi, in front of a dealership that wouldn't open its door. Before I take you back to that road, let me tell you something. This channel tells the stories that nobody else is telling. The forgotten farmers, the overlooked land, the deals that changed everything. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit subscribe right now. Every subscriber tells me to keep digging for the next story. And trust me, the one I'm about to tell you is worth staying for. Let me take you back. In September of 1961, a 30-year-old man named Henry Tate drove his uncle's truck 12 miles into Greenwood, Mississippi, to buy a plow point for a Farmall H. That's all he needed, a $6 plow point, the kind of part any equipment dealer keeps in a bin behind the counter. Henry parked outside Caldwell's John Deere, the only equipment dealer in Lafleur County that carried international harvester parts alongside the green and yellow machines. He walked to the front door, tried the handle. It was locked. He could see people inside. Roy Caldwell, the owner, was leaning against the counter talking to two farmers. A parts man was behind the shelf pulling stock. The lights were on. The sign said, "Open." Henry knocked. Roy looked up, looked at Henry through the glass, and turned back to his conversation. Henry knocked again. Roy didn't move. One of the farmers glanced at the door, then looked away. Henry stood there for 10 minutes. Then he drove home without the plow point. He didn't need anyone to explain what had just happened. Henry Tate was a black man in Mississippi in 1961. Some doors didn't open for him. Not because they were locked, but because the people inside chose not to turn the handle. Now let me tell you who Henry Tate was, because the man standing outside that locked door was not the man Roy Caldwell assumed he was. Henry was born in 1931 in a shotgun house on a cotton plantation outside Itabena, Mississippi. His father, Moses Tate, was a sharecropper who worked 40 acres of somebody else's land for 30 years and never owned a single one of them. Every fall, Moses would settle up with the landowner, and every fall the numbers came out the same. What he owed for seed, fertilizer, and equipment rental was almost exactly what the crop had earned. Some years Moses owed more than the crop. Those years the debt carried over, chaining him to the same land for another season. Henry watched this his entire childhood, watched his father work from dark to dark on ground he'd never own, watched the ledger book that always came out even or worse, watched the system that was designed, deliberately designed, to keep his family working but never building. When Henry was 14, his father said something that carved itself into the boy's mind. "Henry, the only way out of this is to own the dirt you stand on, not rent it, not sharecrop it. Own it, because as long as someone else owns your ground, they own your life." Moses Tate never got out. He died in 1958, still sharecropping the same 40 acres he'd started on in 1928. 30 years of labor, and he left his family nothing but that one sentence. Henry swore he'd live differently. After his father died, Henry worked for 3 years as a hired hand on a large operation outside Greenwood. He was the hardest worker on the crew, and everyone knew it. He could fix any piece of equipment on the place. He could read weather better than the almanac. He could look at a field and tell you within 5 bushels what it would yield. The owner, a white farmer named Jack Parsons, once told his wife, "Henry Tate knows more about farming than I do. If he had his own land, he'd outproduce half this county. But Henry didn't have his own land. And in 1961, Mississippi, banks didn't lend to black farmers. The Farmers' Home Administration, which was supposed to serve all farmers, routinely denied black applicants or gave them smaller loans with worse terms than white farmers received. The USDA county committees that controlled agricultural programs were all white. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way. Henry had saved $4,800 from 3 years of hired work. Every dollar he could keep, he kept. He lived in a one-room cabin on the edge of the parson's place, ate what he grew in a garden patch behind the cabin, owned 2 sets of clothes and 1 pair of boots. He saved the way his father should have been allowed to save, but never could. In the spring of 1961, a piece of land came up for sale that nobody else wanted. 80 acres of low ground near the Tallahatchie River, 4 miles south of Money, Mississippi. The soil was heavy clay, hard to work, prone to flooding in wet years. The timber had been logged 20 years earlier, leaving stumps everywhere. It wasn't farmland yet. It was potential farmland, the kind of land that would take years of clearing and working before it produced anything useful. The owner was an elderly white woman named Mrs. Adeline Cross, whose husband had logged it and died. She wanted $30 an acre. $2,400 for 80 acres. Henry went to the First National Bank of Greenwood and asked for a loan. The loan officer, a man named William Hartley, listened politely for about 2 minutes. "We don't make agricultural loans for that type of property." Henry knew what that type meant. It didn't mean the property. He went to the Farmers' Home Administration office. Same result, different words. "Your application doesn't meet our current lending criteria." Henry drove out to Mrs. Cross's place himself, knocked on her door, explained who he was, what he wanted, and what he could pay. Mrs. Cross was 81 years old. She looked at Henry for a long time. "You have cash?" $2,400. I can pay the full amount." "That land is rough. You know that." "I know it. I'll clear it myself." "My husband always said that ground had good soil under all those stumps. He just never got around to proving it." She sold him the 80 acres, signed the deed herself. Didn't ask the bank. Didn't ask anyone's permission. Henry Tate owned land. For the first time in his family's history, going back as far as anyone could remember, a Tate owned the ground he stood on. He needed equipment to work it. At an estate sale in Tallahatchie County, he found a 1947 Farmall H for $280. The tractor was rough, faded paint, oil leak, worn clutch. But the engine was strong and Henry could fix everything else. He also bought a single-bottom plow for $40 and a disc harrow for $65. Total equipment investment, $385. But the plow needed a new point. The disc needed bearings. And the only dealer within 30 miles that carried international harvester parts was Caldwell's John Deere in Greenwood. That's when Henry drove to Caldwell's for a $6 plow point, and that's when the door stayed locked. I want to ask you something right now. Have you ever been shut out of something you had every right to walk into? Not because of what you could do, but because of who you were. Tell me about it in the comments, because what Henry did after that locked door is going to hit different if you've stood on the wrong side of one yourself. Henry couldn't buy parts from Caldwell's, but he could buy parts from salvage yards, mail-order catalogs, and farm auctions where nobody cared what you looked like as long as your money was real. Within a month, he'd found everything he needed: a plow point from a salvage yard in Clarksdale, disc bearings from a mail-order catalog out of Indiana, a fuel filter from another Farmall he found rusting in a field and bought for $20 just for the parts. He spent the rest of 1961 and all of 1962 clearing stumps from his 80 acres. By hand. No bulldozer, no chain, no help. Just a shovel, an axe, a farmall, and a chain Henry welded together from scrap. He'd dig around a stump, wrap the chain, hitch it to the farmall, and pull. Some stumps took an hour, some took a day. A few took a week of digging before the roots let go. He cleared 40 acres the first year, planted cotton on 20 of them in the spring of 1962. The other 20 went into soybeans. The cotton made half a bale per acre. Not good, but not nothing. The soybeans did better. That heavy clay soil held moisture that sandy ground couldn't. Henry noticed. He filed it away. The soil was telling him something, and unlike most people, Henry listened. By 1963, he had all 80 acres cleared and planted, cotton and soybeans in rotation. He added a vegetable garden that fed him year-round. He started selling surplus vegetables at the market in Greenwood, building a small cash flow outside the commodity markets. Roy Caldwell heard about Henry through the county grapevine. A black farmer on the old Cross place, working it with a worn-out farmall and homemade implements. Roy's reaction was the same as every other dealer and banker in the county. He'll be done in 2 years. That ground isn't worth farming, and he doesn't have the equipment or the capital to make it work. Henry heard the talk, ignored it completely. He had his father's words in his chest like a second heartbeat. Own the dirt you stand on. Everything else is noise. Let me tell you about the next 20 years, because this is where patience became something nobody in Leflore County had ever seen from a man they'd been taught to dismiss. Henry farmed those 80 acres from 1962 to 1982 without borrowing a dollar. He lived on almost nothing, repaired his own equipment, fabricated parts he couldn't buy, grew food he couldn't afford. Every dollar that didn't go to seed, fuel, or taxes went into a coffee can buried under the floor of his cabin. By the late 1960s, his soybeans were outperforming the county average. That heavy clay soil that everyone said was worthless turned out to be perfectly suited for soybeans. It held water through the dry August weeks when sandy ground cracked and withered. Henry had figured this out by watching, not by reading a manual. The same way his father had read weather, Henry read soil. By 1970, he had $14,000 saved. By 1975, $28,000. By 1980, $41,000. In 1972, he bought a second tractor at auction, a 1955 Farmall 400 for $600. Now he had 2 machines, both paid for, both maintained by his own hands in a shed he'd built from salvaged lumber. Jack Parsons, the farmer Henry had worked for, stopped by Henry's place one evening in 1975. He'd been watching Henry's operation from a distance for years. "Henry, I owe you something I should have said a long time ago." "What's that, Mr. Parsons?" "When you worked for me, I told my wife you knew more about farming than I did. I was right. But I should have told you, not her. I appreciate that. How many acres you farming now?" "Still 80. 80 acres, and you're banking more money than most farmers with 300. How? No debt, no payments, no overhead. Everything I make, I keep." Parsons shook his head. "I've got 320 acres, and I owe more than they're worth." "How did that happen?" "You borrowed. I didn't. That's the whole difference." Then the 1980s arrived, and the world that had been built on debt came apart. You've heard this part of the story before: interest rates, price crashes, foreclosures. But in Mississippi, the crisis hit black and white farmers differently. White farmers who'd borrowed from banks and the FHA lost their land when they couldn't make payments. Black farmers who'd been denied those same loans denied the chance to borrow, found themselves in an impossible position. They'd been shut out of the system that was now destroying everyone inside it. For Henry Tate, being denied was the thing that saved him. While farmers around him foreclosed, Henry kept farming. His costs were minimal. No debt service, no equipment payments, no land payments. When soybean prices dropped, Henry tightened his belt and survived. When cotton collapsed, he shifted more acres to beans and added winter wheat to his rotation. He adapted because he had room to adapt. No bank was telling him what to plant or when to sell. And then, like Earl Hawkins in Missouri, like Margaret Holcomb in Kansas, Henry Tate went to auctions. The first farm he bought was 120 acres adjacent to his own, foreclosed in 1983. The bank wanted $200 an acre. Henry offered $160 cash. They took it. $19,200 from the coffee can under the floor. The second was 80 acres across the road, estate, sale in 1985. $180 an acre, $14,400 cash. The third was 160 acres a mile north, foreclosure in 1987. $150 an acre, $24,000 cash. By 1988, Henry Tate owned 440 acres. He was 57 years old. A black farmer in Mississippi who'd been turned away from a dealership, denied by banks, ignored by the USDA, and dismissed by everyone in the county, now owned more land than most of the white farmers who'd been handed every advantage he'd been denied. And he was just getting started. Let me tell you about what happened at Caldwell's John Deere in 1986, because this is the scene that makes the whole story come together. Roy Caldwell's dealership had survived the crisis, barely. He'd laid off half his staff, sold his inventory at a loss, and was running on fumes. One Tuesday morning in March of 1986, Henry Tate walked into Caldwell's John Deere. This time the door was unlocked. Times had changed. Not because hearts had changed, but because money had gotten tight enough to change. Behavior. Roy couldn't afford to turn away any customer anymore. Henry walked up to the parts counter. Roy recognized him, couldn't place where from at first. Then it hit him. The man at the door, 25 years ago. "Can I help you?" Roy said. The words came out careful, like a man stepping on ice. "I need a hydraulic cylinder for a Farmall 400, and a set of disc blades, and a fuel injector rebuild kit for an H." Roy looked at the list. About $340 in parts, a real order, a paying customer. "I can get all of that. Take me a day or two on the injector kit." "That's fine." Henry paid cash. Roy wrote up the ticket. Neither man mentioned 1961, but it was in the room like a third person standing between them. As Henry was leaving, Roy said, "You're farming the old Cross place, right? And the Henderson land, and the parcel across the road?" "That's right." "How many acres total?" 440. Roy went quiet. 440 acres. More than most of his remaining customers, owned by the man he'd left standing outside a locked door a quarter-century ago. "I didn't know that," Roy said. "I didn't know you'd done all that." Henry looked at him. "You weren't supposed to know. I wasn't doing it for you to notice." He walked out with his parts. Roy stood behind the counter for a long time after he left. Let me tell you about the next 15 years, because Henry Tate wasn't finished. Between 1988 and 2001, Henry continued buying land at auctions and estate sales. Always cash, always below market value, always ground that other people had given up on. He expanded to 840 acres by 1995 and 1,200 acres by 2001. He also did something that set him apart from every other large landowner in Lafleur County. He hired young black farmers and trained them, not as sharecroppers, never as sharecroppers, as farm managers who earned wages, learned the operation, and were given the option to lease land from Henry on fair terms with the goal of eventually buying their own. Between 1990 and 2005, Henry helped 11 young farmers get started. He leased them land at below market rates. He lent them equipment. He taught them the same thing his father had taught him. Own the dirt you stand on. Don't rent your life from someone else. By 2010, 7 of those 11 farmers owned their own land. 3 had expanded beyond what they'd leased from Henry. 2 had operations larger than 200 acres. In a county where black land ownership had been declining for 60 years, Henry Tate had reversed the trend single-handedly. The county assessor who visited Henry's farm in 2003 wasn't the only person who noticed. In 2005, the Mississippi Agricultural Extension Service invited Henry to speak at a conference in Jackson. He was 74 years old. He'd never spoken publicly about his operation. He stood at the podium in a room full of agricultural professionals, extension agents, and university researchers. He wore the same thing he always wore, clean work clothes and boots. He spoke for 12 minutes. No notes, no slides, just truth. My father was a sharecropper for 30 years. He worked 40 acres of someone else's land and died owning nothing. The only thing he left me was one sentence: own the dirt you stand on. I've been following that advice for 44 years. I own 1,200 acres now. Never borrowed a dollar. Never made a payment to a bank. Started with 80 acres of stumps and a Farmall that cost less than a good saddle. The secret isn't complicated. Don't owe what you can't cover. Take care of your soil. Take care of your equipment. And don't wait for someone to open the door for you. Build your own door. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then they gave him a standing ovation. Henry Tate is 94 years old now. He stopped farming in 2018 at 87. His 1,200 acres are managed by 3 of the farmers he trained. All of them now in their 40s and 50s, all of them landowners themselves. The 1947 Farmall H sits in Henry's barn, cleaned and maintained. He starts it up once a year just to hear it run. His son, James Tate, farms 400 acres of his own adjacent to his father's operation. James has a degree in agricultural science from Mississippi State. He uses GPS-guided equipment and satellite soil mapping, but he keeps one of his father's handwritten ledger books on his desk. People ask me about my operation, James says. They want to know about the technology, the data, the precision agriculture, and I show them my father's ledger, every acre tracked by hand, every dollar counted with a pencil, no debt in any column, any year, for 44 years. That's the technology that built this place. Everything else is just tools. The J.D. dealer wouldn't let Henry inside the building. 25 years later, Henry owned more land than the dealer's best customer. But Henry doesn't tell this story as a story about revenge. He doesn't tell it as a story about race, though race is woven through every page. He tells it as a story about dirt. My father said, own the dirt you stand on. That's what I did. Didn't matter that the door was locked. Didn't matter that the bank said no. Didn't matter that nobody thought I could do it. The dirt doesn't care who owns it. It just cares whether you take care of it. I took care of it, and it took care of me. He pauses. Same thing's true of people, by the way. The ones who take care of what they have, they're the ones who end up with more. The ones who borrow what they can't afford, they end up with nothing. Doesn't matter what color you are, the math is the same. So let me leave you with this. Right now, somewhere, someone is standing outside a locked door, not because they can't do the work, not because they don't have the skill, just because someone on the other side decided they don't belong. The J.D. dealer wouldn't let a 30-year-old man inside his building to buy a $6 plow. Point. 25 years later, that same man owned 440 acres free and clear, and the dealer's door was open because he couldn't afford to keep it closed anymore. Because Henry understood something the dealer never did. A locked door is just a wall with hinges, and walls don't stop the kind of man who clears stumps with a chain and a Farmall. If this story changed how you think about what's possible when every door is closed, do 3 things. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of American agriculture. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been shut out of something you had every right to be part of, and what did you do about it? And share this with someone who needs to hear that a locked door is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of a different one. The dealer wouldn't let him inside. Henry built his own door, and the dirt remembered every single thing he put into it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.